Welcome back. Tonight, we step inside a place that should be the safest in the world. A village library. Walls lined with books, the smell of old paper, and the kind of quiet that makes you feel nothing bad could ever happen here. But someone died among these shelves, and the only clue left behind is a book that was never returned. This is Murder at the Village Library, a mystery set in 1950s England, where an old woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mind will remind us of something we often forget. Knowledge can be the most dangerous weapon of all. Stay with us. The last page holds the answer, but only if you make it there. Let's begin. The Library After Hours. The village of Chipping Cleghorn was the sort of place where nothing much happened, and the people who lived there preferred it that way. It sat comfortably in the English countryside, somewhere between Middlesex and Memory, the kind of village that appeared on no important map, but existed quite permanently in the hearts of those who called it home. There was a post office that smelled of ink and toffee, a church whose bell had been slightly off-pitch since 1931, and a butcher named Mr. Hobbs, who knew everyone's order before they asked. And then there was the library. Chipping Cleghorn. Public Library stood at the far end of Larkspur Lane, a modest two-story building of grey stone with tall, narrow windows that caught the afternoon light beautifully and the morning cold terribly. It had been built in 1887, donated by a local merchant family whose name was now only remembered on the brass plate beside the front door. Inside, it smelled the way all good libraries smell, of dust and paper and time, with the faint ghost of someone's forgotten tea. The library opened at 9 in the morning and closed at 6 in the evening, Monday through Saturday. It held approximately 4,000 books, 3 uncomfortable reading chairs, 1 small desk near the window where the borrowing register lived, and Miss Eleanor Voss. Miss Voss had been the librarian for 22 years. She was a thin, careful woman of 53, with grey hair pinned so precisely it looked architectural, and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck as though they were something precious. She spoke quietly and moved quietly, and she knew where every single book in that library belonged. If a volume was even slightly out of place, she noticed within the hour. Visitors who returned books with bent spines received a look from Miss Voss that required no words whatsoever. She lived alone in a small cottage on the other side of the lane, a 5-minute walk from the library door. Every morning she arrived at 10 minutes to 9. Every evening she left at 6:15. After the chairs were straightened, the register was closed, and the front door was locked with the large iron key she kept in her coat pocket. Tuesday, the 14th of October, had been by all accounts a perfectly ordinary day. Mrs. Aldgate had come in to return 2 novels and borrow one on cottage gardening. Old Mr. the Finch had sat in the corner chair for 3 hours, reading a railway encyclopedia he had no intention of borrowing. A young mother with a small child had briefly caused chaos in the children's section, and Miss Voss had quietly restored order with the patience of someone who had seen worse. By 5:30, the library was empty. Miss Voss made her final round of the shelves, as she always did. History, biography, natural science, fiction. She straightened 2 books, noted that someone had placed a novel about the Crimean War in the poetry section, and corrected this without expression. She returned to the front desk, made one last entry in the borrowing register, capped her pen, and put on her coat. Then she paused. The back reading room light was still on. She walked to the rear of the library. She passed the tall shelves of reference books and the wall of local history, and switched off the light. The room fell dark. She stood there a moment, just a moment, looking at the shelves in the dim evening light that came through the narrow window. She went home, or that is what for everyone assumed. The next morning it was Mrs. Aldgate who raised the alarm, which was somewhat ironic given that she had only come back to ask whether the library had a book on pickling. She arrived at 10 minutes past 9, noticed the front door was unlocked, and stepped inside, calling out a cheerful good morning. When no answer came, she walked further in, past the desk, past the fiction shelves, toward the back reading room where the light, oddly, was on again. Miss Eleanor Voss was on the floor between the shelves. She was lying quite still, her one arm extended, her reading glasses beside her on the floor as though they had simply slipped from her hand. A single book lay open near her feet, face down, its spine bent in a way that would have distressed her greatly had she been in any position to notice. Mrs. Aldgate did not scream. She was not that sort of woman. She stepped back carefully, walked to the front desk, and used the telephone to call the police. Then she sat down in one of the uncomfortable reading chairs and waited, hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. Inspector Gerald Crowe arrived from the county station at 10:30. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with a methodical manner and the particular expression of someone who has seen enough unpleasant things to have stopped being surprised by them. He brought with him a young constable named Briggs, who looked as though he had only recently stopped being surprised by everything. The police surgeon confirmed what Mrs. Aldgate had already suspected. Miss Eleanor Voss had been dead since some time the previous evening. The cause, the surgeon said carefully, would require further examination, but there were no obvious signs of violence, no wound, no struggle. The shelves around her were undisturbed. The room was tidy. She had simply stopped. Inspector Crowe walked the length of the library twice, hands in his pockets, saying very little. He examined the front door, which showed no sign of forced entry. He looked at the borrowing register on the front desk, turned a few pages without particular interest, and closed it again. He spoke briefly with Mrs. Aldgate, thanked her for her composure, and told Constable Briggs to take her statement. By noon, a small group had gathered on Larkspur Lane outside the library. Villages of this size are sensitive to disturbance the way a still pond is sensitive to a stone. Word had moved quickly, through the post office, through the butchers, through the particular telephone network of women who keep a village informed of itself. Among those who heard the news that morning, in the usual course of village conversation, was an elderly lady who lived in a house called Mead, at the other end of the village. She heard, set down her knitting, and looked out the window for a moment. Then she put on her grey coat, found her handbag, and walked to Larkspur Lane. She had, as it happened, a library book to return. Miss Marple Takes Notice. Miss Jane Marple was 71 years old, and she moved like it. Not helplessly, she was quite clear on that distinction herself. She moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned, through experience rather than vanity, that haste was rarely worth the cost it extracted from one's knees. She carried a handbag of sensible brown leather, wore a grey wool coat that had been good quality once and was still perfectly adequate, and walked with a slight favouring of her left side that became more noticeable in cold weather. October in Chipping Cleghorn was quite cold. She had lived in St. Mary Mead all her life, which was a different village entirely, but she had a cousin, a quiet woman named Dorothy, who lived just outside Chipping Cleghorn, and Miss Marple had been visiting for the past week. Dorothy's spare bedroom had a draught that came from somewhere unidentifiable, and Miss Marple had woken that morning with a stiffness in her shoulders that she had chosen not to mention at breakfast. She had the library book in her handbag. It was a volume on alpine flowers, borrowed 10 days ago when she had thought she might take an interest in Dorothy's garden. She had not, as it turned out, taken much interest in Dorothy's garden. The book had sat on the bedside table, largely unread, but it was due back, and Miss Marple did not keep books past their date. She saw the small crowd on Larkspur Lane from a distance, and slowed her pace without stopping. There were perhaps 8 or 9 people standing on the pavement outside the library, speaking to one another in the lowered voices that English villagers reserve for deaths and scandals. A police car was parked at an angle near the front gate. The library door stood open, which it should not have been at this hour. It was not yet 11. Miss Marple approached the edge of the small gathering. A woman she didn't recognize turned to her immediately with the eagerness of someone who has news and requires an audience. "The librarian," the woman said. "Miss Voss, found dead this morning. Just lying there among the shelves," Mrs. Aldgate said. "Quite cold." "Oh dear," said Miss Marple. She said it simply, without theatre, and meant it. She had not known Miss Voss personally, but she had been to this library twice during her visit, once to borrow the Alpine Flowers book, and once to ask about a local history pamphlet, and Miss Voss had struck her as a precise, serious, capable woman. The kind of woman who does not simply collapse among the shelves she has spent 22 years keeping in order. Miss Marple stood quietly for a moment, looking at the open library door. Then she walked toward it. Constable Briggs stopped her at the entrance with the particular mixture of politeness and firmness that young constables deploy when they are not entirely sure of their authority. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The library is closed this morning. Police matter." "Yes, I can see that," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I've only come to return a book. I expect there's somewhere I can leave it." Briggs hesitated. It was, technically, a reasonable request. "I'll need to take your name, ma'am." "Miss Jane Marple. I'm visiting my cousin Dorothy Prescott on Hawthorne Road. I borrowed this book 10 days ago, and I shouldn't like it to go down as overdue." She produced the volume on Alpine Flowers, and held it out with the mild, patient expression of someone waiting for a bus. Briggs took the book somewhat uncertainly, as though it might be relevant to something. "I'll see that it's logged, Miss Marple." "Thank you." She did not move immediately. Her eyes had gone, quite naturally and without particular emphasis, past Briggs and into the library beyond, to the front desk, to the open borrowing register lying on it, and to the tall figure of Inspector Crow, who was standing near the back speaking to a younger officer. Crow noticed her looking and walked over. "This is Miss Marple," said Briggs. "She had a book to return." Crow looked at her the way men of his profession sometimes looked at elderly women, not unkindly, but with the settled assumption that they were not going to be useful. "Thank you for returning it, Miss Marple. We'll make sure it's properly recorded. Of course," a small pause, "has the cause of death been established?" Crow's expression shifted slightly. "Not as yet. The surgeon is conducting his examination. These things take a little time, naturally." Another small pause. Was the front door forced? No. So she let someone in, or someone was already inside. Crow looked at her more carefully this time. "As I said, we're still in the early stages of investigation." Miss Marple nodded, as though he had confirmed something she already suspected. "I imagine you are. It's just, I was in here recently. You see, I notice things, the way one does." She gave a small, self-deprecating smile, Old habits. Too many years with nothing to occupy one's mind but observation. Crow's expression was professionally neutral. He was not, it was clear, going to invite her further into the library. "I appreciate that, Miss Marple. If you think of anything relevant, you're welcome to speak with Constable Briggs." He returned to the back of the library. Miss Marple looked at Constable Briggs. Briggs looked at Miss Marple. He was young enough that he had not yet developed immunity to the particular quality of attention that very observant elderly women can direct at a person. "The borrowing register," she said quietly, nodding toward the front desk. "Has Inspector Crow looked through it carefully?" "He had a look at it, yes. Ma'am?" "A thorough look." A slight pause. "He looked at it." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I see." She glanced at the register from where she stood. She could not read it from this distance, but she could see that it lay open somewhere in the middle. "Thank you, Constable. You've been very kind." She did not go back to Dorothy's for lunch. Instead, she walked to the small tea room on the high street, a narrow, warm place called Pettifer's that smelled of butter and hot crockery, and sat at a corner table and ordered a pot of tea and a plain scone, neither of which she was particularly hungry for. Her shoulders still ached. She sat with her handbag on the chair beside her and looked out the window at Larkspur Lane, which was just visible from the corner of her seat. She was thinking about the borrowing register. In her 2 visits to the library, she had stood at the front desk long enough to notice certain things. The register was a large cloth-bound ledger, the kind libraries had used for decades. Each page ruled into columns for the date, the borrower's name, the book borrowed, and the date returned. Miss Voss had maintained it by all appearances with the same precision she applied to everything else. The entries were neat, consistent, dated carefully. What struck Miss Marple now, sitting in Pettifer's with her tea cooling in the cup, was something she had not consciously noted at the time, but which had lodged somewhere in the back of her mind the way small details sometimes did. On her second visit to the library 3 days ago, she had stood at the desk while Miss Voss located the local history pamphlet, and the register had been lying open. Miss Marple had not read it deliberately. She was not that sort of person. But her eyes had moved across the page in the way that eyes do when they have nothing else to rest on. She remembered a name. She wasn't certain whose. But she remembered that one entry, near the top of a page, had no return date filled in beside it. Most entries did. Some recent ones naturally wouldn't yet. But this one had seemed older, the ink slightly different, and the book beside it had been, she frowned, pressing her memory. Something botanical. She was almost sure. She set down her teacup and looked at the window without seeing the street beyond it. A woman in her position, an elderly visitor, no official standing, he already politely redirected by the inspector, was not going to be handed the borrowing register to examine at her leisure. She would need to find another way. Miss Marple picked up the last corner of her scone, ate it without tasting it, and reached for her handbag. She had, she reflected, an afternoon ahead of her. And she had always found that the people of a village, if approached in the right way, were considerably more informative than any official document. She just needed to ask the right people the right questions. Her knees, she decided, could manage a little more walking. They would simply have to. The missing book. The afternoon had turned the colour of old pewter by the time Miss Marple made her second round of the village. She had a method, though she would never have called it that. Method suggested something deliberate and investigative, and Miss Marple preferred to think of what she did as simply talking. She talked to people the way she always had, with genuine interest and without apparent agenda. and people talked back. It was remarkable, really, how much a village contained if you knew where to press gently. She began at the post office. The woman behind the counter was named Mrs. Peel, stout, bright-eyed, somewhere in her late 50s, with the particular alertness of someone whose profession required knowing everyone's business at least once a week. Miss Marple bought a book of stamps she didn't need, and mentioned, in passing, what a terrible thing it was about Miss Voss. Mrs. Peel needed very little encouragement. 22 years she'd been in that library, Mrs. Peel said, leaning slightly over the counter. Never a day late, never a moment's trouble. Quiet as anything. You'd barely know she was there, and then suddenly she was everywhere, if you take my meaning. The library was her, really. Every book in its place, every record kept just so. My Harold returned a book a week late once, back in 1951, and she charged him the penny and wrote it in the register like it was a matter of public record. A pause, with the faint smile of retrospect. She wasn't unkind, just particular. She sounds admirable, said Miss Marple. She was, though not everyone found her easy. Mrs. Impeel lowered her voice by one comfortable notch. She'd had words with Dr. Harlow recently. Over a book, of all things. He'd had it out for weeks, months perhaps, and she'd sent him a written reminder. Written, as though he were a schoolboy. A significant look. He didn't take it well. Miss Marple received this information with a mild nod and moved on. The butcher, Mr. Hobbs, was less forthcoming but more specific. He mentioned, while wrapping something for the customer ahead of Miss Marple, that the library had been looking to expand its reference section, that there'd been some talk of a donation from Mrs. Fenwick, the widow who lived in the large house on Crestwell Road. Generous woman, he said with the slightly reserved tone that suggests generosity noted, but not entirely trusted. Always giving something to somewhere. A library, church roof, the village fete. Makes you wonder sometimes what she's hoping people will think of her. It was not a particularly charitable observation, Miss Marple thought. But it was probably not entirely inaccurate either. She bought nothing from Mr. Hobbs and thanked him pleasantly. It was at Pettifer's she had returned for a second cup of tea, which her shoulders thoroughly deserved, that she encountered the most useful conversation of the afternoon. A young man was sitting 2 tables away, alone, with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He was perhaps 24 or 25. Slight and dark-haired, with the look of someone who had slept poorly and was not making a great effort to conceal it. He wore a grey pullover and had his hands around the coffee cup as though for warmth rather than intention. Miss Marple recognized him, after a moment, from the library. He had been behind the front desk on her second visit, shelving returned books. Miss Voss had called him Thomas. She did not approach him immediately. She ordered her tea, settled herself, and looked out the window for a while. The young man, Thomas, sat very still. He was not reading. He was not looking at anything in particular. He had the particular stillness of someone whose thoughts are too loud to allow for anything else. After a reasonable interval, Miss Marple caught his eye quite by accident, smiled in the mild way of a woman who means nothing by it, and said, "Dreadful news this morning, wasn't it?" It wasn't a question precisely. It was the sort of remark that gives a person the option to agree and look away, or to respond. Thomas Reed looked at her for a moment, measuring something, or perhaps simply surprised to be spoken to, and then said, "Yes, it was." His voice was quiet, a little unsteady at the edges. "You work at the library, don't you?" Miss Marple said. I believe I saw you there last week. I'm Miss Marple. I've been visiting my cousin on Hawthorne Road." He nodded. "Thomas Reed, I was the assistant, part-time." He looked down at his coffee. "I don't quite know what I am now." "I'm very sorry," said Miss Marple, and meant it simply. "It must be a terrible shock. Had you worked with Miss Voss long?" "2 years." A pause. "She was strict but fair. She cared about the place enormously." He stopped. "I can't quite believe she's just gone." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, which was often more useful than saying something, as Thomas Reed, after a silence, said, "The police came to speak with me this morning. Inspector Crowe. He asked me about last night, whether I'd seen anything, whether anyone had been in the library after hours." He looked up. "I left at 5. Miss Voss was still there. She always stayed a bit later on Tuesdays to update the records. The borrowing register. Yes, and the acquisition log. She was very thorough." Miss Marple set down her teacup with the careful quiet of someone who does not wish to interrupt their own thinking. "I noticed the register when I returned my book this morning," she said, which was true enough in its way. "A very well-kept record, by the look of it." Thomas gave a small, sad smile. "She'd have been horrified if it weren't. She checked it herself every Tuesday, made sure everything was properly entered, every return recorded." A slight pause. "She mentioned last week, actually, that there was an outstanding borrowal she was going to follow up on. A book that hadn't come back." Miss Marple looked at him with the mild, attentive expression she had spent 7 decades perfecting. "Oh? Some old reference book. Victorian, I think." She was quite put out about it, more than usual. She said it was a book that had no business being out of the library at all. It was part of the reference collection. Reference books aren't supposed to leave the building. But it had. Someone had taken it, signed it out in the borrowing register, which shouldn't have been done for a reference book, and never returned it. "Did she say which book it was?" Thomas frowned slightly, trying to remember. "Something botanical, I think, old. She described it as— I remember this because it seemed a strange way to put it. She called it a book that people had better reasons to want than to admit to. The tea room was warm and smelled of butter, and the particular comfortable staleness of somewhere that has been the same for many years." Outside, the sky had darkened another shade toward evening. Miss Marple sat quite still. A book that people had better reasons to want than to admit to. She went back to the library at 4 o'clock. It was still technically a police scene, but the crowd outside had thinned, and Constable Briggs had been replaced at the door by an older officer who had the look of someone doing the last hour of a long shift and not finding it stimulating. Miss Marple approached him with her most comprehensively harmless expression, and explained that she had spoken with Inspector Crowe that morning, that she had returned a borrowed book, and that she was concerned it might not have been properly recorded in the register given the circumstances, and she wondered if someone might simply confirm the entry had been made. It took 4 minutes and a great deal of patient pleasantness. But she got inside. The older officer stood near the front desk, while Miss Marple approached the register, which was still lying open where Crowe had left it. She did not rush. She turned to the page she wanted, recent entries the last 2 months, and ran her eye carefully down the columns. The entries were neat. Dates, names, titles, return dates, column after column of Miss Voss's precise handwriting. Every line consistent, every space properly filled. Until one, 2/3 of the way down the page, between an entry for a novel borrowed by someone named H. Aldgate and a library science journal borrowed by Miss Voss herself, there was an entry that was different. The handwriting was slightly wrong. Not dramatically, not obviously forged, but to an eye that had spent the last few minutes reading Miss Voss's meticulous hand, the slight forward lean of the letters, the way the capital letters were formed, was subtly different. As though someone had tried to imitate the style and nearly succeeded. The date was 6 weeks ago. The borrower's name was written simply as Harlow. The book listed was The Poisoner's Garden, a Victorian study of botanical compounds and their properties. The return date column was empty, and Miss Marple looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at the officer, who was examining the ceiling with professional detachment. She closed the register gently. The Poisoner's Garden, a reference book on botanical compounds. Taken 6 weeks ago by someone who had signed it out in handwriting that was not entirely their own, or rather, had been entered by someone attempting to look like Miss Voss, which meant either Miss Voss had written it under some unusual circumstance, or someone else had made the entry on her behalf. And Miss Eleanor Voss, who had noticed the discrepancy, who had described the book as one people had better reasons to want than to admit. Miss Voss was lying on the floor of her own library. The room was very quiet. Miss Marple became aware that her left knee was aching considerably, and that she had not eaten anything since the scone at lunchtime, and that she was standing in a closed library with a police officer who was beginning to look at her with mild curiosity. She thanked him. She retrieved her coat from where she had laid it over one of the reading chairs. She walked out into the grey October afternoon. Her mind, despite the knee and despite the hunger, was working with a clarity she recognized. The particular sharpened focus that came, she had found over many years, not from excitement, but from the quiet certainty that something which had looked like an accident was not one at all. Someone had taken that book. Someone had needed what was inside it. And someone had needed very badly to make sure that Miss Eleanor Voss never told anyone which name was beside it in the register. Secrets between the shelves. Miss Marple slept badly that night. This was not unusual for her. She had slept badly with some regularity since her late 60s, and had made a kind of peace with it. She lay in Dorothy's spare bedroom, with the unidentifiable draught coming from somewhere near the window frame, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought. The thinking was not uncomfortable. It had a shape to it now, the particular shape of something that has moved from vague unease into specific question. There was a dead woman. There was a missing book. There was a name in a register written in handwriting that was almost but not quite right. And there was the matter of what the Poisoner's Garden actually contained. What, precisely, someone had needed from a Victorian study of botanical compounds badly enough to remove a reference book from a library where it had no business leaving. She thought about Dr. Harlow. She thought about Mrs. Fenwick. She thought about Thomas Reed, sitting alone in Pettifer's with a coffee he wasn't drinking. Somewhere around 2 a.m, she fell asleep with her thoughts still moving, and dreamed of nothing she remembered. She was up by 7, which Dorothy found alarming. "You're on holiday, Jane," Dorothy said over the breakfast table, with the mildly reproachful tone of someone whose guest is not behaving like a guest. "I sleep less as I get older," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "It's quite common. More tea?" Dorothy gave her a look that suggested this explanation was insufficient, but poured the tea anyway. Miss Marple ate her toast, said very little, and by 8:30 had put on her grey coat and was on Larkspur Lane. Dr. Gerald Harlow lived and practised from a large Victorian house on the north side of the village, a handsome building that suggested a certain comfort with its own importance. The brass plate beside the door read Dr. G. Harlow, General Practitioner, in letters that had been polished recently. The garden, which wrapped around the side of the house, was the most immediately striking thing about the property. It was exceptional. Miss Marple paused at the gate for a moment, quite genuinely. Even in October, with most things cut back or gone over, the garden had a structured, deliberate quality that spoke of serious attention. There were raised beds along the south-facing wall, neatly mulched. A greenhouse stood at the far end, its glass catching the pale morning light. Climbing plants, dormant now, covered a long iron trellis along the eastern boundary. And along the border nearest the gate, in a long, carefully tended row, grew a series of plants that Miss Marple recognized, one by one, with the botanical knowledge of a woman who had spent a lifetime in a garden of her own. Foxglove, monkshood, belladonna, cut back but unmistakable in its shape. Henbane further along, lily of the valley in a contained bed near the wall. All of them beautiful, all of them, in their various ways, poisonous. Miss Marple stood at the gate for a moment longer than she had intended. She had come, she told herself, simply to call on the doctor. She had a perfectly reasonable pretext. The stiffness in her shoulders had not improved, and a visitor to the village seeking a brief consultation with the local GP was entirely unremarkable. She rang the bell and waited. Dr. Harlow answered the door himself, which suggested his receptionist had not yet arrived. He was a tall man of about 60, with heavy grey eyebrows, and the kind of face that had probably been handsome at 40, and had since settled into something more formidable. He wore a tweed jacket and looked at Miss Marple with the measured patience of a man who is accustomed to people arriving unannounced with complaints. "Dr. Harlow, I'm so sorry to call without an appointment. I'm Miss Marple. I've been visiting my cousin Dorothy Prescott on Hawthorne Road, and I've developed rather a troublesome stiffness in my shoulders. I wondered if you might have a few minutes." He had, as it turned out, 20 minutes before his first scheduled patient. He showed her into his consulting room, which was orderly and smelled faintly of something Miss Marple couldn't immediately identify. Clean and green and slightly sharp, like a garden brought indoors. There were framed botanical illustrations on the wall. A bookshelf held medical texts alongside several volumes on horticulture. On the corner of his desk, half beneath a manila folder, she could see the spine of a book, old, dark-covered, half-hidden. She could not read the title from where she sat. He examined her shoulders with professional thoroughness, asked several sensible questions, and recommended warmth and a particular kind of gentle exercise that she was unlikely to perform. Throughout, he was perfectly civil, neither warm nor cold, simply efficient. A doctor doing his job. "Yeah, I imagine it's been a difficult morning for the village," Miss Marple said, as she settled her coat back around her shoulders. Such dreadful news about Miss Voss. Something moved in Harlow's face. Very small, there and gone. "A shock," he said. "She'd been the librarian here a long time." "Did you know her well?" "As well as one knows anyone in a village of this size." He was straightening things on his desk, not looking at her directly. She was a competent woman, ran the library well. "I understand you'd had some recent correspondence with her," Miss Marple said in the mild, slightly apologetic tone of someone repeating village gossip they feel slightly embarrassed to know. "Over an overdue book. I heard it mentioned. These things travel in a small village." The straightening of things on the desk stopped. Minor misunderstanding, Harlow said. His voice was still even, but something had gone out of it, the easy efficiency of a few moments before. I'd had a book out for longer than anticipated. She sent a reminder. I intended to return it. Of course, a small pause. Which book was it? He looked at her directly for the first time since she had mentioned Miss Voss. His grey eyes were steady and quite unreadable. A reference volume. Something I needed for a particular case, a patient with an unusual reaction. I was checking some botanical interactions. How interesting, said Miss Marple. Your garden is remarkable, by the way. I noticed it coming in. A wonderful collection. Thank you. The words were automatic. He was still looking at her with that steady, unreadable expression. I find plants instructive, as there's a great deal medicine owes to botany. There is, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. A great deal of good, and, one must acknowledge, a great deal of the opposite, historically speaking. She smiled. He smiled back slightly. It was the smile, she thought, of a man working out whether he had just been told something. She thanked him for his time, declined his offer to bill her cousin for the consultation, and left. In the garden, walking back toward the gate, she passed the long border of plants again. The foxglove, the monk's hood, the belladonna, bare and cut back, its dark stems still perfectly visible against the pale October soil. She did not hurry. Mrs. Honoria Fenwick received her at 11 o'clock with considerably more warmth than Dr. Harlow had managed, and the house on Crestwell Road was large. Larger than it needed to be for a widow living alone, and decorated with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had both money and opinion. There were flowers in every room, none of them artificial. A fire was going in the sitting room despite the fact that it was not especially cold. Mrs. Fenwick herself was a handsome woman of perhaps 65, broad-shouldered, white-haired, dressed with more care than the hour strictly required, and possessed of the natural hospitality of someone who genuinely enjoyed an audience. She had heard about Miss Voss, naturally. She had been one of the library's most significant donors, had funded the new reference shelving 3 years ago, the reading chairs the year before that. A terrible loss, she said, pouring coffee with a steady hand. Eleanor Voss was, well, she was the library, really. I can't quite imagine the place without her. She paused. I shouldn't say this, perhaps, but we weren't always perfectly in agreement, she and I. She could be rather rigid. I suggested once that the library might host a small exhibition, local history, photographs, that sort of thing, and she was quite firm that the library was for books and reading, and not for what she called peripheral entertainments. A small, slightly rueful smile. She wasn't wrong, I suppose. She just wasn't particularly diplomatic about it. Had you seen her recently? Miss Marple asked. Something shifted in Mrs. Fenwick's expression, just slightly. She set down the coffee pot. I was in the library last week, yes. I go in fairly regularly. I like to see how the donation has been used, ask whether they need anything further. And did you speak with Miss Voss? Briefly. A pause. She seemed preoccupied. She mentioned she had an administrative matter to resolve. She didn't elaborate. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The library's reference collection is quite good, I thought. I noticed some interesting older volumes when I was in. Yes, the reference section was always her particular pride. Mrs. Fenwick's voice had shifted very slightly, become a degree more careful. She was very protective of those books, wouldn't have them moved, or lent, or interfered with in any way. Quite right, said Miss Marple. A reference collection is only useful if it's complete. She watched Mrs. Fenwick's face as she said it. The older woman was looking at the fire. Her expression was composed, pleasant, entirely normal. and completely impossible to read. "More coffee, Miss Marple?" "Thank you, no," said Miss Marple. "I mustn't stay too long." She found Thomas Reed at the library. The building was still officially closed. The police tape across the front entrance had not moved, but Thomas was standing outside it with a small bunch of keys in his hand, looking at the door with an expression that suggested he had walked here without being entirely conscious of doing so. He looked up when he heard her approach. "Miss Marple." "Good morning, Thomas. How are you sleeping?" It was a direct question and slightly unexpected, and he answered it honestly because of both. "Not well. No." She stood beside him and looked at the library door. "I imagine not." They were quiet for a moment. A car passed on Larkspur Lane. Somewhere down the street, someone was burning leaves. The smoke drifted faintly toward them, autumn and particular. "I've been thinking," Thomas said finally, "about what Miss Voss said last week when she mentioned the outstanding book." Miss Marple waited. "She said, I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought she was just being her usual, particular self about it. She said that the person who'd taken it would be very keen to make sure it didn't come back." He paused. "I thought she meant because of the overdue fine, or embarrassment about having kept it so long." He stopped again. His voice, when he continued, was quieter. "I don't think that's what she meant now." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "I don't think it was." He turned to look at her. He was young and he was frightened, and he was trying not to show either. "Do you know who did it?" Miss Marple looked at the library door for a long moment. "I have a strong suspicion," she said carefully. "But a suspicion is not a certainty. And a certainty is what's needed before one says anything that cannot be unsaid." She looked at him. "There's something I need to see again. The register, specifically the entry I found yesterday. I need to look at it more carefully than I was able to." "I have keys," Thomas said. He looked at the bunch in his hand as though noticing them again. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I know." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the door. Then, with the slightly dazed decisiveness of someone who has spent a sleepless night arriving at a conclusion, he found the right key and put it in the lock. The library opened. It smelled the same as it always had. Dust and paper and time. The reading chairs sat where they always sat. The shelves stood in their long, ordered rows. The borrowing register was on the front desk where the police had left it. Miss Marple crossed the room, sat down in Miss Voss's chair, which felt deeply wrong and also, in the circumstances, necessary, and opened the register to the page she needed. She looked at the entry for the poisoner's garden for a long time. Then she looked at the entries above and below it. Then she turned back 3 pages and looked at a series of earlier entries. Then she turned forward again. She sat back. Her shoulders ached. She had been on her feet since 8:30, and it was now nearly noon. She was, she thought honestly, quite tired, more tired than she would have been 10 years ago, doing the same thing, and there was no use pretending otherwise. But she understood now what she was looking at. The handwriting in the entry for the poisoner's garden was not Miss Voss's. She had confirmed that. But it was also not, she now saw, comparing it with other entries across multiple pages, a crude forgery. It was a careful one, someone who had studied Miss Voss's hand, who had the patience and the steadiness to replicate it closely. Closely, but not perfectly. The capital H in Harlow was wrong. In every other instance across the register where Miss Voss had written the letter H, in history, in Hargreaves, in the date notation TH for Thursday, The letter had a particular slight backward lean to the upright strokes, a habit so ingrained it appeared in every single one. In the entry for the poisoner's garden, the H was upright, which meant the person who had written that entry had been very careful and very nearly right, and had missed one small thing. And the person who had been most closely positioned to study Miss Voss's handwriting, to watch her make entries day after day, to know the register intimately enough to find the right page and make an entry that would almost pass unnoticed. Miss Marple closed the register. She looked at Thomas Reed, who was standing near the door, watching her with the expression of someone who is not sure they want to know what comes next. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I need you to think very carefully. In the last 6 weeks, has anyone other than Miss Voss ever made an entry in this register? Anyone at all?" he thought. She could see him working back through the days, the routine of the library, the ordinary hours of an ordinary working week. "Once," he said slowly, "about 6 weeks ago, Miss Voss she'd gone into the back room to deal with a delivery. Someone came to the desk to borrow a book. I was shelving. The person said they were in a hurry, that they'd sign themselves in." He stopped. Miss Voss came back and didn't seem to notice. Or if she did, she didn't say anything. "And who was it?" Miss Marple asked. But even as she said it, she thought she already knew. The wrong H, the careful forgery, the botanical garden and the Victorian reference book, and the name that had been placed in the register as though it belonged to someone else. Thomas told her. She nodded very slightly. Yes, that was exactly right. A second visit to the register. Miss Marple did not go directly to Inspector Crow. This was a decision she made quietly, walking back down Larkspur Lane toward Dorothy's house, with the October wind coming at her from the east, and her left knee registering its opinion of the morning's activities in terms that were difficult to ignore. She had a name now, or rather, she had a confirmation of what she had already begun to suspect. But a name, she reminded herself firmly, was still not a case. What she had was this: a forged entry in a borrowing register, a missing book on botanical poisons, a dead librarian who had noticed the discrepancy and had not, apparently, been quiet about the fact that she intended to resolve it, and a person who had been at the desk on the day the entry was made. But what she did not yet have was the connection between the book and the death. She did not have motive made explicit. She did not have the book itself, which was, she suspected, no longer in anyone's possession in any recoverable form. And she did not have a cause of death, which the police surgeon had not yet formally established. Inspector Crow, she thought, was a methodical man. He would require more than an old woman's reading of a handwriting discrepancy in a library register. He would be polite. He would thank her. He would tell her they were pursuing their inquiries. And he would file whatever she said in the particular mental category that police inspectors reserve for well-meaning civilians who watch too many things and understand too few. She needed to understand more before she spoke. Dorothy's sitting room was warm, which Miss Marple was grateful for, and Dorothy herself had gone out to the Women's Institute, which Miss Marple was also, privately, grateful for. She sat in the armchair nearest the fireplace, put her feet up on the small footstool that Dorothy kept there, and allowed herself 20 minutes of simply sitting. She was tired, not the productive tired of a morning well spent, but the deeper tired that came from age and cold, and the particular effort of keeping one's mind moving when one's body would sincerely prefer to stop. Her shoulders had not improved despite Dr. Harlowe's advice. Her knee was unhappy. She had a slight headache that had been present since breakfast and was not improving. She closed her eyes. She was not sleeping. She was thinking, which sometimes looked the same from the outside, but felt entirely different within. She was laying out what she knew in the orderly way she had developed over many years. Not a method, not a system, simply the habit of a mind that preferred things arranged. The entry had been forged by someone who had access to the desk, who knew the register, who had a reason to borrow the poisoner's garden, and a reason not to want their own name beside it. The name written instead was Harlow. The doctor, the man with the botanical garden, the man who had received a written reminder about an overdue book and had not taken it well. Someone had tried to make it look like Harlow's borrowing. But Harlow, when she had visited him, had not behaved like a man whose name was in a register next to a book about botanical poisons and a dead librarian. He had been guarded, certainly. He had been careful with his words. Absolutely. But his guardedness had the quality of a man concealing something, not the quality of a man afraid of something. There was a difference, and it was one Miss Marple had spent enough years observing to feel fairly confident about. Mrs. Fenwick, on the other hand. Miss Marple opened her eyes and looked at the fire. Mrs. Fenwick had been careful in a different way. Her carefulness had been social, performative, the carefulness of a woman who has spent a lifetime managing what she reveals and what she does not. Her comment about Miss Voss being preoccupied had been offered too smoothly, too helpfully, the kind of detail that people volunteer when they want to seem transparent and have thought about exactly what transparency should look like. And Thomas had told her who had been at the desk 6 weeks ago. It had not been Mrs. Fenwick. It had not been Dr. Harlow. It had been someone she had not yet fully considered, or rather someone she had considered, and then, to her mild professional embarrassment, set slightly to one side because the other two had seemed more immediately obvious. This was, she reflected, exactly the kind of mistake she had warned herself against making. The obvious suspects were obvious for a reason. They were meant to be seen. The less obvious one was less obvious for a different reason entirely. She sat forward in the armchair. By 3 o'clock she had her coat on again. She had eaten lunch. Dorothy had left cold meat and bread, and a note saying there was cake under the cover on the kitchen counter. And she had found her reading glasses, as which had been in her coat pocket the whole time, and which she had somehow managed not to locate until she had looked in 3 other places. This sort of thing happened more than it used to, and she had made a policy of finding it mildly amusing rather than distressing. She walked back to the library. Thomas was still there. He had, it seemed, nowhere else particularly to be, and the library's familiar disorder of being simultaneously a crime scene and a place he had spent 2 years of his life had left him in a kind of suspended uncertainty about what he was supposed to do with himself. He let her in without being asked. "I need to look at the register again," Miss Marple said, "more carefully this time. And I need my glasses, which I now have." She sat at the front desk again. She put her glasses on. She opened the register, and the difference, seen properly through the correct lenses, was even clearer than she had thought. She went back further than she had before. 4 months, 5. She was not looking at the entry for the poisoner's garden this time. She was looking at something else, something she had registered only vaguely on her first examination, and now needed to confirm. She found it on a page from July. A second entry, not the botanical book, something else entirely, a volume of local history, in the same slightly wrong handwriting. The same upright H made, according to the date, 8 weeks before the entry for the poisoner's garden. A practice run, she thought. Someone who had been working up to something, who had tested whether an entry in this handwriting would pass without notice, and had found that it did. And the name on the July entry was different. Not Harlow, a different name entirely. A name that meant nothing to Miss Marple at first reading, and then, on second reading, meant quite a great deal. She sat with her finger on the page and looked at the name, W. Fenwick. She looked across to the return date column. The book had been returned. The return date was filled in 3 days after the borrowal. A normal entry. Nothing suspicious about it on its own, except that the handwriting was wrong. And the name, Miss Marple took her finger off the page and sat back. Mrs. Honoria Fenwick, widow, donor of the reference shelving and the reading chairs. A woman who visited the library regularly enough that her presence would not be remarked upon. A woman who had been in the library recently and had found Miss Voss preoccupied. A woman whose husband, the late W. Fenwick, had apparently borrowed a volume of local history 8 weeks before the poisoner's garden went missing. Mr. Fenwick had been dead for 4 years. Dead men did not borrow library books. Miss Marple removed her glasses and pressed her fingers briefly to the bridge of her nose. The headache was still present. The fire was not lit in the library, and the room was cold in the particular way of old stone buildings in October, and she was, she thought with a frankness she generally reserved for private moments, considerably more tired than she liked to admit. But she understood now what she was looking at. Mrs. Fenwick had not made one forged entry. She had made at least 2, perhaps more if Miss Marple had time and energy to look further back. She had been practicing for months, learning the register, learning the handwriting, building with patient deliberateness the ability to place a name in the record that wasn't her own. And then she had placed Harlow's name beside the most dangerous book in the library. The question, the remaining question, the one that still separated suspicion from certainty, was why? What was in the poisoner's garden that Mrs. Fenwick had needed? What had she used it for? And what, precisely, had happened to Miss Eleanor Voss? The surgeon's report had not yet been released. No cause of death had been officially confirmed. Miss Marple thought about the foxgloves in Dr. Harlow's garden, and then thought, deliberately, carefully, about the kind of garden a wealthy widow might keep behind a large house on Crestwell Road, unseen from the street, be unvisited by anyone with a professional interest in what grew there. She thought about Mr. Fenwick, dead 4 years. She thought about what a Victorian study of botanical compounds might contain specifically in its chapters on plants that mimicked natural causes. She stood up slowly. Her knee protested. She let it. "Thomas," she said. He looked up from where he had been sitting, very quietly, near the door. "Do you know anything about how Mr. Fenwick died?" "Mrs. Fenwick's husband 4 years ago," Thomas thought. "Heart, I think. People said it was his heart. He'd not been well for a while. Everyone knew." A pause. Dr. Harlow was his doctor. Of course he was, thought Miss Marple. Of course. "One more question," she said. "Does the library keep records further back than this register? Older borrowing logs?" "In the back room. Miss Voss kept everything. She never threw anything away." "I thought she might not," said Miss Marple. "She sounds like she was an excellent librarian." She picked up her handbag. She put her glasses back in her coat pocket, where they had been all morning. She looked at the register one last time, at the entry for the poisoner's garden, with its upright H and its empty return date column, and she thought about Miss Eleanor Voss, sitting at this desk every Tuesday evening, updating her records with the care of someone who believed that accuracy mattered. Miss Voss had noticed the wrong H. Miss Marple was almost certain of it. She had looked at that entry and known, with the instinct of someone who had read the same handwriting for 22 years, that something was wrong. And she had begun to understand what it meant. And she had, in whatever conversation had taken place in this library on the evening of the 14th of October, made the mistake of letting that understanding be known. Not to the police, not to anyone who could help her. To the wrong person. Miss Marple walked to the library door and paused with her hand on the frame. "I'll need to come back tomorrow morning," she said, "to look at the older records." "I'll be here," said Thomas. She nodded. She walked out onto Larkspur Lane. The afternoon was nearly gone. The light was the colour of ash, the air cold and smelling of leaf smoke and coming rain. She had one more thing to find before she could go to Inspector Crow. One more piece, and then the picture would be complete. The Garden of Motive. It rained in the night. Miss Marple heard it beginning some time after midnight. A steady, unhurried rain of the kind that settles in for hours, rather than passing through quickly. It drummed softly against the window of Dorothy's spare bedroom, and found unerringly the draught near the window frame and made it slightly worse. She lay in the dark and listened to it, and did not sleep for a long time. She was thinking about gardens. She had always found gardens useful for thinking, not in a romantic sense. She was not given to romanticizing things, which was perhaps why she was often more accurate about them than people expected, but in the practical sense that a garden was a place where cause and effect were very clearly demonstrated, where what you put in determined what came out, and where patient and deliberate tending produced results that could look, to the casual observer, entirely natural. Mrs. Fenwick's garden was at the back of the house on Crestwell Road. Miss Marple had not seen it. She had seen only the front, the well-kept path, the clipped hedge, the window boxes empty now in October. But she had been thinking, since her conversation with Thomas the previous afternoon, about what a woman like Mrs. Fenwick might choose to grow in a private garden, unseen from the street, attended to with the same careful deliberateness she brought to everything else. A woman who had spent months practicing a handwriting that wasn't hers. A woman who had removed a Victorian reference book on botanical compounds from a library where it had no business being removed from. A woman whose husband had died 4 years ago of what everyone said was his heart. What everyone said. Dr. Harlow had been Mr. Fenwick's doctor. He had signed, presumably, whatever needed to be signed. He had a garden full of poisonous plants and a professional knowledge of what they did. And his name had been placed in careful forged handwriting beside the most incriminating book in the library. Miss Marple turned this over in the dark for a long time. By 3 o'clock she had arrived at something that felt, with the particular solidity of things that are true, like the correct shape of events. She was at the library by 9. Thomas let her in. He had the look of someone who had slept marginally better than the night before, but was still operating at a deficit. He had made tea. There was a small kettle in the back room, and Miss Marple discovered, and a box of tea bags and 2 mismatched mugs, and he handed her one without being asked, which she accepted with genuine gratitude. The older records were in the back room, as he had said. Miss Voss had kept them in a row of cardboard archive boxes on the lowest shelf, each one labelled by year in her precise handwriting. They went back 30 years, to before Miss Voss's time even, maintained by whoever had been librarian before her, and then continued by Miss Voss herself with the same unfailing consistency. Miss Marple wanted 4 years ago. She found the box, carried it to the reading table in the back room. Thomas helped her lift it, which she accepted without comment, and opened it. The older borrowing registers were thinner than the current one, bound in the same cloth but worn at the corners with use. She found the register for 4 years ago and opened it. She knew roughly what she was looking for. A date, sometime in the spring or early summer, she suspected, based on nothing more precise than instinct, and a vague recollection of Thomas mentioning that Mr. Fenwick had not been well for a while before his death. People who are not well for a while before their death tend to become most seriously unwell in the cold months, which meant the preparation, if there had been preparation, would have been earlier. She turned pages. February, March, April. The entries moved past her. The ordinary borrowings of an ordinary village library, novels and biographies and gardening books, and one surprisingly robust demand for volumes on the French Revolution in the spring of that year, which she noted with mild curiosity and set aside. May, when she slowed. She was not looking for a specific title this time. She was looking for the handwriting, the slightly wrong handwriting she now knew well enough to recognize in a page of other entries, the upright H, the particular way the letter D was formed, the faint forward lean that appeared when the forger was being careful and disappeared when they were moving quickly. She found it on the 14th of May. One entry. A book called Fenwick. W. No, that was the borrower. She blinked and looked again, reminding herself that she was tired and needed to be precise. The borrower was listed as Fenwick to W. The book was Cardiac Conditions and Their Management, a physician's reference, 1948 edition. The return date was filled in, 8 days later. Miss Marple sat very still. A medical reference book, borrowed in the name of a man who was... She checked the date of Mr. Fenwick's death, which Thomas had looked up for her in the local newspaper archive that the library kept in a filing cabinet near the window. Dead 11 weeks later, in late July of the same year, of what his death certificate recorded as cardiac failure. The handwriting on the May entry was the same slightly wrong handwriting. The same upright H in Harlow. No, in Fenwick this time, but the H in the borrower's name was unmistakable once you knew it. Someone had borrowed a book on cardiac conditions in the name of a man who would die of cardiac failure 11 weeks later, and then 4 years later had borrowed a book on botanical poisons in the name of the dead man's doctor. Miss Marple set down the register. She wrapped both hands around her mug of tea, in which had gone lukewarm, and looked at the wall of the back room, at the shelves of archive boxes, at the spines of 30 years of borrowing records, at the single narrow window through which the morning light came grey and rain-washed. She was not, she told herself carefully, jumping to conclusions. What she had was a pattern. A consistent pattern certainly, but a pattern was not proof. The entry in May might have been innocent. The book might have been borrowed for any number of reasons. The handwriting similarity might be, no. She stopped that thought firmly. She had been reading handwriting long enough to know what she knew. But she needed one more thing, not from the register, from somewhere else entirely. Well, she left Thomas with instructions to say nothing to anyone. Instructions he received with the seriousness of someone who has been waiting for a purpose, and walked, despite the rain, and despite her knee, and despite the fact that she had not yet eaten anything today, and was aware of this as a distant but persistent fact, to Crestwell Road. She did not go to the front door. She walked along the road until she found the public footpath that ran behind the properties on the south side, an old right-of-way marked on the village map that Dorothy kept in the kitchen drawer, running between the rear gardens and the field beyond. Miss Marple had consulted this map at 7 that morning over her first cup of tea, which was the kind of thing that seemed excessive until it became necessary, and the footpath was muddy from the rain, and the light was flat and grey. She walked carefully, watching where she put her feet, with the particular concentration of someone who has learned that a twisted ankle at 71 is not an inconvenience, but an event. She counted the properties from the end of the row. 3, 4, 5, Crestwell Road number 8, the large house. She stopped at the low fence line that separated the footpath from the rear garden. She looked. The garden was large and well kept, even in October. There were rose beds cut back for winter, a neat lawn still green, a vegetable patch along the far wall, a small ornamental pond. And along the sunny south-facing border that ran the length of the garden nearest the footpath fence, Miss Marple stood in the rain and looked at the border for a long time. It was not as immediately striking as Dr. Harlowe's garden. It was less obviously a collector's border. It did not have the greenhouse, the raised beds, the deliberate botanical variety of a man who studied plants professionally. It looked at first glance like an ordinary cottage garden border, the kind of planting that any competent gardener might have, a mixture of things, some ornamental, some seasonal, some simply filling space. But Miss Marple was not looking at it at first glance. She was looking at it with the eye of a woman who had kept a garden in St. Mary Mead for 40 years, who had grown things and failed to grow things and learned from both, and who knew what plants looked like even when they were cut back and bare and trying to look like nothing in particular. Digitalis, 3 plants in the middle of the border, cut back but unmistakable. She knew the rosette of basil leaves, low to the ground, the way the foliage grew even in its dormant state. Aconitum, monkshood, at the far end. Just 2 plants, but substantial ones, the kind that had been there for several years. And beside the ornamental pond, in a contained bed with a low edging of stones, several plants she had to look at more carefully to be certain of, but was, after a moment, quite certain of. Lily of the Valley. Convallaria majalis, every part of it poisonous, and particularly, she recalled this from a volume she had read many years ago, in an entirely different context, the water in which cut stems had been standing, the glycosides it produced, the effect they had on cardiac function, cardiac failure, and the rain was falling on Miss Marple's hat and coat and running off the brim in small streams. Her feet, in their sensible shoes, were damp. Her knee had been lodging complaints for the last 20 minutes that she had been comprehensively ignoring. She stood at the fence and looked at the garden and thought about a man named Fenwick, who had died in July 4 years ago, and about his widow who donated money to the library and sat by her fire and poured coffee with a steady hand, and about a Victorian book that described, in the careful clinical language of the 1880s, exactly what Lily of the Valley could do to a heart that was already weak, and a doctor who would look at the results and see only what he expected to see. She thought about Miss Eleanor Voss, who had maintained her records with absolute precision for 22 years, and who had kept every register, and who had noticed a handwriting discrepancy, and understood, too slowly as it turned out, and too privately, what it meant. Knowledge, thought Miss Marple. The most dangerous weapon of all. Dangerous in the having of it, and she looked at the greystone house beyond the garden, dangerous in the knowing who else has it. She turned and walked back along the muddy footpath. She had what she needed. It was time to speak to Inspector Crow. She found him at the police station, which was a small brick building on the high street that also served as the local magistrate's office on alternate Thursdays. He was at his desk with what appeared to be the surgeon's report open in front of him, and he looked up when she was shown in with an expression that was, she thought, marginally less dismissive than the one he had worn 2 days ago. The surgeon's report, perhaps, had given him something to reconsider. "Miss Marple," he said, "sit down, please." She sat. She put her damp handbag on her lap. She looked at him steadily. "The surgeon's report," she said. "May I ask, was there anything unusual in the toxicology?" Crow looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the report. "We're still awaiting the full results," he said carefully, "but there are indications that this may not have been a natural death." "Cardiac glycosides," said Miss Marple. The room was very quiet. Crow put down his pen. "What do you know, Miss Marple?" She opened her handbag, took out the small notebook in which she had written, and in her careful handwriting, everything she had found in the last 2 days. The register entries, the dates, the handwriting discrepancy, the name, the garden, the older records, the death of Mr. Fenwick 4 years ago, and she placed it on the desk in front of him. "Everything," she said simply. "I know everything, and I believe you'll find, when the toxicology is complete, that it confirms it." Crow picked up the notebook. He began to read. Miss Marple sat and let him read. And outside the rain continued, steady and unhurried. And she thought of Miss Voss's empty chair at the library desk, and of all of the things a woman can know and keep perfectly ordered and lose, at the last, because she told the wrong person at the wrong moment. It was a very old story, she thought. Knowledge as a weapon, and silence as the thing that should have protected her, and didn't. Miss Marple sets the trap. Inspector Crow read the notebook twice. Miss Marple sat and waited. She had learned over many years that the waiting part of things was where most people made their mistakes. They filled silence with explanation, with reassurance, with the nervous elaboration of people who are not quite confident enough in what they have said to let it stand on its own. She had no such anxiety. She had said what she had to say. The notebook contained what it contained. Crow was a methodical man, and he would reach his conclusions methodically, and hurrying him would not improve the quality of those conclusions. She looked at the wall of the police station, and which had a framed photograph of the county constabulary from 1947, and a notice board with several things pinned to it that she did not read because they were not relevant. Crow set the notebook down. "This is," he said, and paused, with the expression of a man selecting his words with care, "a significant set of observations." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "the handwriting analysis is something a document examiner could confirm formally. I am not a document examiner. I am simply a woman who has been reading handwriting for 70 years and knows when something is not quite right." A small pause. "But the register entries are there. The dates are there. The older records are in the library archive, box labelled 4 years ago, on the lowest shelf in the back room. The May entry is on page 43. Crow looked at her. "You counted." I marked the page with a bus ticket from my coat pocket. I thought it might save time. Something moved in Crow's expression. Not quite a smile, but the proximate region of one. He picked up the notebook again and looked at the page where she had written Mrs. Fenwick's name, and the details of the garden, and the observation about the lily of the valley and its properties. "You went and looked at her garden," he said. It was not entirely an accusation. "I went for a walk along the public footpath," Miss Marple said, "which is a right-of-way, and has been for, I believe, several centuries. I looked at what was visible from the path. A garden is not a private document." "No," Crow agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "The toxicology report is not yet complete. We expect the full results by tomorrow morning. If what you're suggesting about the method is correct, convallaria glycosides," said Miss Marple. "They are detectable, but they require a pathologist who is specifically looking for them. They are not part of a standard screen. If the initial examination proceeded on the assumption of natural causes, which it may well have, given that there were no signs of violence, then they might have been missed. I'll make sure the pathologist is aware of what to look for. That would be sensible." Another pause. Crow tapped the notebook with one finger, not looking at it. "Miss Marple, even with the toxicology, even if the results support your theory, what you have here is circumstantial. Forged register entries, a garden that contains plants also found in many English cottage gardens, a book that is currently missing and cannot be produced as evidence. A death 4 years ago that was attributed to natural causes at the time and was not questioned by the attending physician." He looked up. "Mrs. Fenwick is a respected woman in this village. She has been here all her life. She has donated money to local institutions. I cannot walk up to her door on the basis of a handwriting observation and a footpath view of her garden." "No," said Miss Marple, "you cannot." "So what exactly are you proposing?" Miss Marple had been considering this since the footpath. She had been considering it through the walk back to Larkspur Lane, and through the conversation with Thomas she had stopped to have on the way, and through the brief and practical conversation she had conducted with herself about whether what she was about to propose was sensible or reckless, and had concluded that it was probably both, but that the alternative, doing nothing and allowing Mrs. Fenwick to remain comfortably in her house on Crestwell Road, while a case was quietly built around circumstantial evidence that might take weeks, was worse. "I'm proposing," she said, "that you give me this afternoon, and that this evening you have 2 officers positioned discreetly near the library on Larkspur Lane." Crow looked at her steadily. "Why the library?" "Because," said Miss Marple, "I am going to invite Mrs. Fenwick to meet me there, and Dr. Harlow, and Thomas Reed," she paused, "and I am going to give Mrs. Fenwick the opportunity to make a mistake." She went to Dorothy's for lunch. She was hungry, properly hungry, the kind that comes from 2 days of insufficient eating and excessive thinking, and she sat at Dorothy's kitchen table and ate a full plate of soup and bread without speaking very much, while Dorothy watched her with the expression of someone who has long since accepted that they do not entirely understand their cousin, but has made peace with this. "You look tired, Jane," Dorothy said. "I am tired," Miss Marple said, "but I have one more thing to do." Dorothy refilled her soup bowl without being asked. Miss Marple accepted this gratefully and said nothing more about it. The invitations, she thought of them as invitations, though they were delivered in person and were more in the nature of firm requests, went out at 2 o'clock. To Thomas Reed first, because he was the easiest, still at the library, still purposeless, still frightened in that quiet way of his. She told him what she needed from him, and what she needed him to do, and he listened with complete attention, and said yes without hesitation. To Dr. Harlow second, at his house on the north side of the village. She told him, at his front door, that she had information relevant to Miss Voss's death that she believed directly concerned him, and that she thought he would want to be present this evening at the library when she shared it with Inspector Crow. She watched his face as she said it. The guardedness was there, as it had been when she first visited, but behind it, now that she was looking for it with clearer purpose, she could see something else. Not guilt, fear. A different quality entirely from the careful social management of Mrs. Fenwick. Harlow was afraid, she thought, not because he had done something, but because he suspected what had been done and had been living with that suspicion for 4 years, silent and unspeakable, trapped by the particular professional ethics of a doctor who cannot accuse without certainty and cannot have certainty without investigation, and cannot investigate without admitting he signed a death certificate he now doubts. 7 o'clock, she said, at the library. He looked at her for a long moment. Will Inspector Crowe be there? Yes. He nodded once and closed the door. To Mrs. Fenwick, last. Miss Marple walked to Crestwell Road in the mid-afternoon light and rang the front bell and waited and thought of nothing in particular, which was a skill she had developed over many years as a form of mental conservation. Mrs. Fenwick answered the door herself. She was wearing a different dress from the morning, dark blue, well-fitted, and her white hair was as immaculate as before. She looked at Miss Marple with a smile that was warm and entirely untroubled. "Miss Marple, what a surprise! Come in." "Thank you, I won't stay," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I only came to pass on a message, really. Inspector Crowe is gathering some people at the library this evening, 7 o'clock, to discuss the circumstances of Miss Voss's death. He's asked me to let you know, as one of the library's significant supporters, that he thought you'd want to be present. He has some questions about the reference collection, I understand, the borrowing records." A small pause, entirely natural in its timing. "He's being very thorough, going through everything." Mrs. Fenwick's smile did not change, not even slightly. "Of course," she said, "I'll be there." "Lovely," said Miss Marple. 7 o'clock? She walked back down the path. She did not look back. The library at 7 in the evening was a different place from the library in daylight. Thomas had turned on the reading lamps. The library had 4 of them, positioned between the shelves, each casting a pool of warm yellow light that did not quite reach the corners. The front desk lamp was on. The borrowing register sat on the desk open to the page Miss Marple had indicated. The back reading room, where Miss Voss had been found, was dark. Crowe was there when Miss Marple arrived at 10 to 7, with Constable Briggs positioned outside and another officer in plain clothes standing in an unremarkable way near the back of the fiction section. Crowe had read her notebook twice more that afternoon, he told her, and had spoken with the pathologist, who had confirmed that a targeted test for convallaria glycosides was underway and preliminary results were expected by morning. "If it comes back positive," Crowe said quietly, "we have something to move on." "It will come back positive," said Miss Marple, "but by morning may be too late. Mrs. Fenwick is a careful woman. If she spends tonight thinking about what I said to her this afternoon, what the phrase going through everything might mean, she may decide that some things need to be dealt with before morning. The plants in the garden. Anything remaining from the poisoner's garden that she may have written down or retained," she paused. "It is better to have her here." Thomas arrived at 7:05. He was pale but composed. He stood near the desk without being asked, which was exactly where Miss Marple needed him. Dr. Harlow arrived at 7, exactly. He walked in with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is not yet sure if it is the right one, and stood near the reference shelves with his hands in his jacket pockets, not looking at anyone in particular. Mrs. Fenwick arrived at 7:05. She came in warmly, a coat, a scarf, a bag over one arm, and looked around the library with the easy confidence of someone who has been in this room many times and has always belonged here. She greeted Crow with a nod, acknowledged Thomas with a small smile, glanced at Harlow, something very fast-moving between them, too fast to read fully, and turned to Miss Marple with an expression of pleasant inquiry. "Quite a gathering," she said. "Thank you all for coming," said Miss Marple. She had done this before, in her way. Not formally. She had no official standing in any of it, never had, never would, but the gathering of people into a room, the laying out of things, the watching of faces. She had done it in St. Mary Mead more than once, in one form or another. And she knew that the most important thing was not what she said, but the order in which she said it, and where she was looking when she said it. She began with Miss Voss. She spoke about her simply and directly, her 22 years, her precision, her care for the register, her understanding of every book in this library. She spoke about the particular kind of intelligence that reveals itself not in brilliance, but in consistency. The intelligence of a woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. She noticed, Miss Marple said, that an entry in this register was not in her own handwriting. It was very close, close enough that many people would have missed it. But Miss Voss had been writing in this register for 22 years, and she knew her own hand the way you know your own voice. She paused. She knew, when she looked at the entry for the poisoner's garden, and that she had not written it. She looked at the register on the desk. Everyone in the room looked at the register on the desk. "The entry bears the name Harlow," she continued, "Dr. Harlow." And I imagine, when Miss Voss began to understand what she was looking at, that name concerned her greatly. A doctor, a book about botanical poisons, a reference collection book that should never have left this building. She let a moment pass. But the entry was not made by Dr. Harlow. Dr. Harlow did not take that book. She looked at Harlow. He was looking at the floor. Dr. Harlow, she said quietly, has been carrying a suspicion for 4 years. About a patient, about a death, about a certificate he signed in good faith that he has since, I believe, come to doubt. She looked at him until he raised his eyes. "You knew, didn't you?" "Not certainly, but enough to trouble you." Harlow said nothing, but the expression on his face said everything that needed to be said. Mrs. Fenwick said, in a voice of perfect, pleasant reasonableness, "Miss Marple, I'm not sure what this has to do with the entry was made by you," said Miss Marple. She said it simply. Not as an accusation, simply as a fact, the way you would observe that it was raining or that the fire had gone out. The room was very still. Mrs. Fenwick looked at Miss Marple. For the first time since she had walked into the library, her face was entirely unreadable. The warmth was gone, the pleasantness was gone, and what was underneath was something that had been very carefully managed for a very long time, and had not expected to be looked at directly. "That's a serious thing to say," Mrs. Fenwick said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Oh, it is, but the register goes back further than this page." She nodded toward Thomas, who opened the register to the second marked page, the July entry from 4 years ago. "There is an entry here from 4 years ago, also in your handwriting, though you were very careful, in the name of your husband, who had been dead for 3 months at the time this entry was made." Something happened in Mrs. Fenwick's face. Very small, there and gone, but there. "You borrowed a medical reference on cardiac conditions in your husband's name," Miss Marple continued, 4 years ago, before his death, to understand, I think, what his doctor would see and what he would not. What a weakened heart would look like, from a physician's perspective, and what the natural progression of cardiac failure would present as. She paused. And then there is the older entry from the May before that, also in your handwriting, which I suspect was a practice run, testing whether the forgery would pass without comment. It did. Miss Voss didn't notice it then. She noticed it now. You cannot prove any of this, Mrs. Fenwick said. Her voice was steady, impressively steady. Miss Marple noted this with a kind of professional detachment. The handwriting can be confirmed by a document examiner, Miss Marple said. The entries are dated and cannot be altered without destroying the register entirely, which you didn't do because you couldn't. The register was here, always accessible, and removing or destroying it would have been far more conspicuous than leaving it. She looked at her steadily. The toxicology report on Miss Voss will be complete by morning. I have spoken with the pathologist about what specifically to look for. The lily of the valley in your back garden, which is visible from the public footpath, has been noted. And the exhumation of your husband's remains, which Inspector Crow will be applying for tomorrow morning, will, I expect, tell its own story. Mrs. Fenwick was silent. The library was silent. Miss Marple felt, quite suddenly and without drama, the tiredness that she had been keeping at bay for 2 days settle over her like something solid and heavy, the tiredness of her age and of the cold and of the case and of the particular sadness of being right about things like this. Miss Voss came to you, Miss Marple said. Her voice was quieter now. Didn't she? That evening, she had worked it out, or enough of it, and she came to you. Perhaps she thought she was giving you a chance to explain yourself. Perhaps she thought you would deny it, and she would go to the police. She was a precise woman, and a careful one, but I don't think she was a cruel one, and I think she wanted to be wrong. A pause. She was not wrong. Mrs. Fenwick looked at the register. Walter was not a good man, she said. Her voice had changed. The pleasantness was entirely gone, replaced by something flat and old and tired in its own way. He was not well, and he was not going to get better, and he was not kind in those last years. There is a great deal that illness does to a person, and some of it is forgivable, and some of it— She stopped. He would have gone on for years. The doctor said so, years. She looked at Miss Marple with an expression that was not guilt, precisely, and not defiance, precisely, but something in between that Miss Marple had seen before on the faces of people who have done terrible things and know it, and also, somewhere beneath the knowing, continue to believe they had reasons. I did not think anyone would ever find it. No, said Miss Marple, I don't suppose you did. Crow stepped forward. Mrs. Fenwick did not resist. She set her bag down on one of the reading chairs, carefully, as though she were simply leaving it to collect later, and she went with Crow without making a scene, which was, Miss Marple thought, entirely in character for a woman who had spent 4 years being very careful about how things appeared. The library door closed. Thomas stood very still near the desk. He was looking at the place where Mrs. Fenwick had been standing. A Harlow had sat down in one of the reading chairs and had his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, in the attitude of a man releasing something very heavy that he has been carrying for a very long time. Miss Marple stood and did not say anything to either of them for a moment. The room smelled of dust and paper and time. The reading lamps made their warm yellow pools in the quiet. She looked at the register, still open on the desk, the marked entries visible, Miss Voss's careful handwriting running in its neat columns through 22 years of this village's ordinary life. She thought of Miss Voss coming to Mrs. Fenwick that evening. Precise, careful Miss Voss, who had kept every record and noticed every discrepancy, and had, at the last, made the very human mistake of believing that the truth, properly presented, which was a safe thing to carry into a room. It was not always safe. That was the thing about knowledge. It was not safe for the having of it. It was not safe for the sharing of it. It was a weight, and sometimes the weight was too much, and sometimes it was carried by exactly the wrong person, at exactly the wrong moment. Miss Marple looked at the register for a long moment. Then she reached out and closed it. The last entry. After Crow left with Mrs. Fenwick, the library was very quiet. Thomas made tea again